Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. So we were in the middle of looking at Chazal and their interactions with the science and culture and philosophy of the time. I'd like to finish off one aspect of the Gamora in Psachim that we were having a look at, and I don't think we succeeded completely in finishing. And I was then asked to, I was asked about to comment about the articles that no doubt you've seen in the media, in the Jewish Chronicle and Jewish News and others, around ordination of a lady, or of women rabbis, and the sort of fuss that's going on at the moment around ordination of ladies who claim to have received Orthodox smicha, and what's going on around that. And I'm happy to speak about that because that actually ties into perhaps one topic that we could look at, which is the influence on Chazal in a cultural area on their perspectives, and is it possible that some of the halachas around the role of women are affected by these matters? So I thought it's a good chance to speak about that also. So first, I'd like to just finish off about the Gamora, another look at the Gamora in Psachim. I think we looked inside at the Gamora in Psachim in Tzati Daled on the base, in which the Gamora talks about the path of the sun. In fact, I'll just very briefly share my screen with you again, just to remind you about the debate. This is a Gamora in Psachim that discusses what the route of the sun is, where the sun goes at night, and Chachmei Umas Olam, the scholars and sages of the world, believed that the sun goes below the earth at night. So the path of the sun is over through the sky, as you should be able to see from my cursor, and at night it then goes below the earth, whereas the initial view of Chachmei Yisrael is that it goes behind the firmament, behind the Rakia. The Rakia is this idea, astronomical idea, that there is a dome over the earth and the sun hides behind this dome, and that's why it's invisible at night, and then it reappears in the morning underneath the firmament, and that's the path of the sun. And what we saw in the Gemara is that the Chachmei Yisrael, the sages of Israel, admitted or acknowledged the correctness of the view of the Chachmei Umas Olam, of the sages of the world, the secular sages, that the sun did not go behind the firmament, but instead went below earth. And they said two reasons, they said several reasons for this acknowledgement, but basically were convinced by the science that they were presented with that this was the case. This is a very important source in the whole topic around what they did and didn't know, and to what degree they relied on the science of their time. Because this seems to be an explicit Gemara in which they acknowledge that they got this wrong, and the view of the Chachmei Umas Olam was correct. Let's have a quick look at the Gemara again, just because this is such an important source. This is the Gemara in Psachim. Chachmei Yisrael Omrim, v'yom chama ma'aleches lemata min harakia. In the day, the sun goes below the firmament, or belayla lemala min harakia. In night, it goes above the firmament. Chachmei Umas Olam Omrim, no, v'yom chama ma'aleches lemata min harakia. In the day, it goes beneath the firmament, or belayla lemata min hakaka, and at night, it goes below the ground. Omar Rebbe, said Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, their words appear more reasonable than our words. Should be yom minus sonanin or velayla roasting, because in the day springs are cold, and at night springs are hot. So there's a number of things to notice in this Gemara. The first thing to notice is that Chachmei Yisrael acknowledged, or at least Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi acknowledged, that it would appear that the Chachmei Umas Olam are correct. That's the first point to make. The second point to make is that in truth, in current understanding, both models are wrong. It is true that the sages of the world were more correct than Chachmei Yisrael, because the sun doesn't go above the Rakia, this imagined dome over earth, but rather it goes below the earth. However, even the Chachmei Umas Ha'olam, the secular sages, at least as reported by the Gamora, believe in the concept of the Rikiya. They simply say that in the day it goes below the firmament, and at night it goes below the earth. They all accept the concept of the firmament, and indeed, from what we know, this was the view of the Greek philosophers and scientists of the time. The third point to mention is that the reason Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi acknowledges their correctness is because of the phenomena of springs being cold in the day and hot at night. Now, why would springs be cold in the day and hot at night? Well, the answer must be because in the day, the sun is above the earth, distant from the springs, but at night, the sun goes below the earth, deep below the earth, where the well springs, the Mai, are not. The springs draw their water from, and therefore they are warmed up by the sun. Now, again, this is something that is not in line with current scientific thinking. We do not believe the reason why the springs are warmer at night is because the sun goes below the earth. And in fact, we don't believe in a flat earth model at all. Even the sages of the world who talk about the sun going below the earth are picturing, at least in this model, a flat earth in which the sun goes below this flat plate-like disk and therefore warms up the springs whose well springs are deep below the ground and closer to the sun at night. More than that, we don't believe that the reason why springs are hotter than the earth at night is because they're being warmed by the sun, but we believe it's just due to the relative thermal properties of water and earth, in which water takes longer to heat up and therefore is relatively speaking colder in the day, and longer to cool down and therefore is relatively warmer at night. It's simply a product of thermal properties that water lags behind the earth, and this is an observable phenomenon. So these are a number of things to say about the Gamora. Now, this Gamora is interesting on many levels. First of all, it's one of Chazal's own reflections about their relationship to science, and at least according to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, seems to indicate that they were prepared to acknowledge the scientific correctness of an alternative view to their own. They weren't claiming they had some sort of spiritual Torah insight into this, but they were saying this was our understanding, and if it turns out we're wrong, it turns out we're wrong, not a big deal, okay, we'll live with that. We bow to the authority of the scientists, as indeed is the halacha in other areas, such as medical matters. If you have a shaila, a question around eating on Yom Kippur, you consult a doctor, and then obviously you have the psak about how to balance this with shiurim and other things, but the primary basis of medical information will be determined by halacha based upon what the doctors say. And halacha is a sophisticated system to integrate the views of the doctors along with halacha, and also to balance when you have conflicting medical reports. Sometimes doctors themselves are uncertain, and then there's methods that can be used in psak to determine what to do. So this seems to be in line with that thinking. This is also an important source because it doesn't seem to be one in which it is possible to argue nishtana hateva, that nature has changed. We looked in previous weeks, we looked last week, I think, at the argument of nishtana hateva, which makes a lot of sense in certain particular scenarios. Where does it make sense? I think we looked at the Gamora, which talks about the period in which a cow can give birth, what age it needs to be in order to be able to give birth. And we saw Tosfos, who says nishtana hateva, because in Europe we find that cows give birth even before this age. So this is a perfectly normal area where one would expect the teva, science, to have changed. This is exactly the sort of case where you would expect science to change. The aging of cattle, different climates, 1,000-year gap, different parts of the world, selective breeding that takes place. This is the sort of change with which we're familiar. To argue that the path of the sun has changed, however, over time seems to be taking the concept of nishtana hateva, that the world changes and science changes out of any reasonable proportion. And indeed, this isn't how Chazal defended themselves against their critics. Quite the contrary, they said that we acknowledge that we are following the view, need to bow to the view of the secular scientists. Now, finally, we have a question over here. Is it possible that when Chazal talk about science, their words should be taken allegorically, as a metaphor, rather than referring directly to scientific matters. And again, I want to stress, and possibly next week we'll look at this in more detail, there is a reputable history of understanding things in that way. It is perfectly reasonable when using the language of metaphor and allegory to convey midrashic ideas or poetic ideas or mystical secrets or philosophical ideas, to use metaphor in a way that isn't, strictly speaking, scientifically correct. None of us have a problem with poems and allegory using language in a way that we understand from our human perception. This is both in terms of general speech and in terms of metaphor and midrashic ideas. So for example, we're all perfectly happy to talk about sunrise and sunset. And indeed, this is the language of psukim themselves, because we understand this is from our perspective, this is how it appears to be. Similarly, when wishing to talk about matters of the seriousness of mitzvahs or the effects, spiritual effects and damage done in the realm of failure and avera, it's perfectly reasonable to talk about the language of current medical understanding. So forgive the example, but people may talk about an area of, I don't know, corrosive social breakdown, as this is a cancer consuming our society. And we understand that they're using that language in line with current medical understanding and metaphor. And if medical understanding changes, then the language may itself become dated and inappropriate. It's never perhaps particularly appropriate metaphor to use. It's not necessarily the right one anyway, but we understand that this is the way humans speak. And it's Chazal, it's possible they also use metaphor like that. In this Gemara over here, there have been those who suggest that when Chazal were talking about the path of the sun, they meant it to convey some form of spiritual content rather than a scientific fact. And in fact, you could argue this a little bit in the language of the Gamora, because Rebbe doesn't quite acknowledge that Chazal got it wrong. He simply says their words, their model appears better than our model. Let's have a look again at the language in the Gamora. So Rebbe said as follows: "V'nirin divrayim midvarenu." Their words appear to be more accurate than our words. Nirin devarim midvarenu. Their words appear to be more accurate. The statements of the sages in English would appear to be more accurate than our statements. Meaning to say, he's not necessarily saying the sages got this right. The non-Jewish sages got this right. He's saying, I recognize that the appearance appears to be like them. Now, nowadays, we would say more than the appearance appears to be like them. We have no doubt, we have no serious consideration that the model put forward is correct and that the sun really goes behind a firmament. Nonetheless, maybe that Rabbi isn't acknowledging we never meant this to be a scientific debate. This was always a midrashic debate, an allegorical debate. But we recognize that on the physical level, what they said appears to be correct. Nonetheless, this does not seem to be a reasonable reading of the Gemara, nor is it in line with how the Rishonim understood the Gemara. Both the Gemara itself and the Rishonim seem to take this source as a scientific discussion with practical implications for Halacha. Halacha needs to understand the world and the way it is, and then paskin. So if you understand how a microwave works, you will then come up with a psak about its use on Shabbos, whether it is bishul or isn't bishul, and so on and so forth. If you're misinformed about how medical treatment works, then you may come up with a wrong psak about a particular form of medical treatment. And the Gemara seems to be in line with that, because the Gemara itself speaks about this phenomena of the heating of springs at night, and the Rishonim link this to the concept of Maim Shalonu, which I mentioned last week, of using water which has been removed from the well the night before to bake matzahs in order to ensure the water is not warm the next day when matzahs are being baked, because even though one has 18 minutes to assume fermentation, in which one can assume fermentation doesn't occur, when mixing flour with cold water, warm water speeds up fermentation. To ensure the water is cold, one needs to draw the water from the well at night. So is the concept of Maim Shalanu. And Tosfos Rid, the Piskei Rid, and others explain that this is linked to this idea of the sun going below the earth at night. And this in turn is based on a model of the debate between the sages of the world and the sages of Israel. and in turn based upon an assumption that the springs are warm at night because of a flat Earth or disc-shaped model in which the sun goes below the plate, the disc, rather than below the globe. Secondly, there is considerable halachic debate around how to do the shkia, the sunset calculations. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but sunset and sunrise are the easiest of the astronomical phenomena to determine. So when we deal with nightfall, for example, how dark is dark, how many stars have come out, this is clearly a difficult matter to determine. Similarly, when we talk about alos hashachar, dawn, at what point is it bright enough to be considered dawn? These are complicated halachic matters. There's a sort of an arbitrariness around them, which halacha needs to cut through and make a decision. When it comes to sunrise and sunset, the disappearance and appearance of the body of the sun is a relatively simple calculation and not in and of in itself halachically controversial. Other than the view of Rabbeinu Tam, because Rabbeinu Tam had a view that sunset, shkia as we talk about it, does not refer to the visible shkia, the visible sunset, the visible disappearance of the sun from the earth at the time that we observe the sun disappearing, but rather is a later time, some minutes later than the observable setting of the sun. And this is the source of one of the more stringent views of how to do the calculation of Motzi Shabbos. Now, this is based upon a complex sequence of Gemaras that I'm not going to go into at this particular point in time, other than to say that one way of understanding the view of Rabbeinu Tam, and this is how Tosfos and Rabbi Akiva Eiger seem to understand this, is that this is based upon the model of the firmament model. The idea that the sun, even when it's invisible to us, is still somehow present on earth because it is moving behind the firmament. And Rabbeinu Tam seems to understand that this could have an implication for how we do the calculation of shkia. Now, in current halacha, the vast majority of Klal Yisrael do not follow the chumrah of Rabbeinu Tam and shkia. There's a minority who still follow his stringency. Rabbeinu Tam has, in general, ceased to be the mainstream psak. And there's a lengthy biur halacha who discusses why Rabbeinu Tam the view is no longer the consensus one, even though even at the time of the Shulchan Aruch, perhaps it was. And Rabbeinu Tam's, one of the reasons the biur halacha gives is by quoting a source who says that because we no longer view Rabbeinu Tam's view as astronomically justified, it is clear and apparent to us that this is not the correct shkia, and therefore we don't paskin like his opinion. So again, we see how one views the path of the sun could, in theory, in principle, have halachic implications. I'm not taking sides here as to whether we do or don't paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, and the matter is of considerable more complexity. All I'm saying is that the Rishonim seem to have understood the Gemara as referring to an observable scientific phenomena, and in which case we have an explicit source, a Gamora and Pesachim, in which the sages acknowledge that at least in certain instances they did not have a supernatural understanding of science. They relied on the scientists of their time, and they were able to admit when they were wrong or right about that fact. So just to summarize what we've said so far, we've seen a number of Gemaras which seem to be based upon a certain scientific perspective, and in some cases having halachic implication. We'll need to look next week about what to do about that. I mean, if it does have halachic implication, how do we handle this? But nonetheless, there are several approaches that one can take, including nature changing, which sometimes is a very possible answer, or including the idea that that's nightfall. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat here about nightfall, but I'm not going to go into the astronomical aspects of this. Or based on the idea that the Chazal were relying on the science at the time, or perhaps we're using the language of metaphor. The Gamora and Pesachim, which talks about the path of the sun, doesn't seem to fit any of these. It seems to be clearly a scientific Gemara. so it is understood by the Rishonim, it isn't a candidate for nature changing, and seems to be a primary source that Chazal followed the best scientific advice of their time, and therefore would change their minds. Indeed, it is explicitly used so by Rabbi Ram ben Harambam, the son of the Rambam. Rabbi Ram discusses this Gemara, and he says, what a wonderful Gemara this is. This is a Gemara that's teaching us how responsible individuals behave, follow the best scientific advice at the time, and be able to acknowledge your mistakes if scientific consensus and evidence alters. So this is indeed what he draws out of the Gemara, and he is following the path of his father, the Rambam himself, who adopted this stance that when Chazal reference science, they are relying upon the scientists of their time. So this is a very, very important source in this topic, the concept of following science and Chazal, doing so and acknowledging that. I want to emphasize here, however, and we'll look at this in more detail next week, that this is not a universal idea, meaning to say there are scientific pieces of information where Chazal explicitly claim divine inspiration, and I'm not talking about those. We are chas v'shalom not in the business of looking at those when it comes, for example, to Hilchos Treifas, to the laws of rupture to organs and damage to an animal, which will cause it to die within a year and therefore make the animal treif. Chazal explicitly say this is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is something revealed to us. This is not what we're referring to when we're talking about Torah and science. I'm here talking about examples where Chazal do not have a particular tradition from halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Now, I've been asked in the chat a couple of points. One is, this seems to support the view, the minimalist position, we'll call it, that Moshe Rabbeinu was not told everything at Sinai. He was not told fully how nature works. Our discussion in the previous series about the maximalist and minimalist position, how much was Moshe taught about, was around how much Torah was Moshe taught, how much Halacha was Moshe taught. Was he taught the full development of future Halacha or not? It wasn't a discussion about his knowledge of science. This is a separate debate, and this is what we're talking about over here. Were Chazal informed as a tradition for Moshe about all scientific matters or not? That is a separate debate. And I'm arguing over here that the Gemara indicates that there are at least some situations where they relied on the secular scientists rather than their own tradition. You can adopt, in principle, a maximalist position around Torah Sheba'al Peh, that Chazal were taught everything about, Moshe was taught everything about Torah, and that was all part of the tradition of Torah, but nonetheless, the application to scientific facts maybe is left to the scientists, to reliance on the science of the time. So these are two separate discussions. And then we've looked at how much of Torah was handed down as a tradition. We're now looking at whether science was handed down as a tradition, and at least in some cases, the Gemara Pesachim, it would appear that science wasn't, though in other cases, like Treifas, which we'll look at next week, science would appear to have been handed down. I've then been posted on the group questions about opinions of sunset, and yes, David, your response is right. This is about nightfall, not about sunset. But again, I'm not going to go, my purpose of talking about the calculations of the times was simply to bring out the fact that in principle, this could be affected by our scientific understanding, though in practical halacha, it really isn't. I'm not aware of practical implication other than the view of Rabbi Tam, which arguably was based upon a flawed scientific model and is acknowledged as such by a commentary called a place called the Maram al-Shaka, brought by the Mishnah Berurah, by the Biur Halacha, and indeed, perhaps for that reason, the Mishnah Berurah suggests Rabbeinu Tam's Pesach has gone out of popularity. I want to shift, as I said, to look at another example of possible influence on Chazal based upon the scientific understanding at the time, and here, based upon cultural insight at the time. And here I want to look at a non-scientific matter, but a cultural matter, and the role of women, since this has become something that's somewhat of a sort of controversy at the moment in the discussion. The background very briefly is that a lady who teaches in LSJS achieved ordination, semicha, from an organization which claims to be in line with orthodoxy. And the chief rabbi, who is the, I'm not sure exactly his title, but he's certainly the halachic and rabbinic authority of London School of Jewish Studies, which in turn was a successor to Jews College, said that she could not be a fellow of the school, of London School of Jewish Studies, due to her adopting the title of rabbi or rabbah and claiming Orthodox semicha based on that. So this has been widely reported in the Jewish media, and I think it hit Women's Hour on the BBC, and has become somewhat of a discussion point. Now, I'm not going to use this forum to go fully into issues of women and halacha and their role in halacha, because it's a complicated matter and one that really perhaps for another series on Sunday mornings deserves its own share. However, I want to make a couple of philosophical points since I was asked to address this and since it ties in to our topics. But before I do that, if someone can just indicate to me, did we discuss in this forum and look at the sources around women leaning in the Seder? Is this something that we discussed? No, okay. So I want to start off with a topic linked to this, to discuss for a few minutes impact of cultural assumptions around halacha in another way, how that could impact on Chazal. And this is based on the Gamora in Pesachim again, in which the Gamora says that ladies do not engage in haseba, in leaning on Seder night. Now, why do ladies not engage in leaning on Seder night? Well, the reason we do haseba on Seder night is because it is derech cherus. It's a way of expressing freedom. Now, one has to express freedom in a manner which indeed expresses cherus, expresses freedom. And since at the times of Chazal, leaning expressed freedom, therefore we have halacha that on Seder night we do haseba, we lean whilst drinking. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that this is explicitly a takana, a decree of Chazal, built upon, predicated on cultural practices at the time, in which this was a reasonable way to express freedom. Who nowadays leans as a way of showing freedom? Isn't at all a way that we show that we're free when we are eating. So if one wants to take a very purist approach, in which one argues there's no cultural influence on Chazal from the surroundings, I don't think this is tenable within a reasonable reading of the halachic system. The model of Seder night and how it is structured is explicitly built upon a way of expressing freedom in line with how it was done at the time. And we continue to do so to this day because of force of takana, of rabbinic decree and minhag and the like. And it's a very effective way of actually of internalizing the message of Seder, making it a very memorable event. So there's no philosophical problem around this concept, but it's a very clear example of cultural circumstances at the time seeming to affect Chazal's, how Chazal established we should do things. Now, it is possible to argue with what I just said and say that somehow leaning is a fundamental expression of freedom. It doesn't appear to be the case. It appears that this is an expression of how freedom, how luxuriating and comfort used to be expressed in, as per some of the images that we have from the ancient world, in which people would lie and recline whilst eating. Free people would do so. Now, why does a lady not lean? Because, well, the Rashbam says, because emas baleim aleim, the awe or fear of their husbands is on them, and they wouldn't be comfortable leaning in front of husbands to whom they demonstrated a degree of respect and awe. The Shulchan Aruch paskins this, Isha eina tzricha haseba, a woman doesn't need to lean. And the Ramah, in his footnotes written for Ashkenazim, quotes the Mordechai, an important Ashkenazi Rishon, who says, Noshim shelonu chashuvas, our ladies are chashuv, and therefore they do lean. By the way, leaning is an important halachic concept in Seder night, such that if you drink your arba kosis and you don't lean in certain situations, you will need to go back and repeat the drinking. So it's a sort of integral to the, or the eating of matzah, I should say more accurately. It's integral to the eating of the matzah, and sometimes means one wouldn't be yotza the mitzvah, and in certain cases when we need to go back on drinking the wine also. Now, ladies, because the Gemara says they're not obligated to lean, even the Ramah acknowledges that if they didn't lean, they don't have to go back. Nonetheless, they should lean according to the Ramah. They're in practice, or according to the Modchai, they're in practice, as I said, this isn't commonly done. Now, what does the Modchai mean when he says Noshim Didon Chashuvas, our ladies are Chashuv and therefore they lean? So really it's based on the Gemara, because the Gemara lady says that an Isha Chashuva leans. The reason a lady doesn't lean is because it's not their practice to lean. This isn't a way of showing freedom normally. However, for an Isha Chashuva, for an important lady who does experience, who is able to lean because she's an important lady, she will need to lean. And all that the Modchai is saying is that our ladies have become chashuv, they have become important, and therefore they do lean. Now, how are we meant to make sense of this? What's the change that has occurred? So there's a fascinating teshuvah from Rav Moshe Feinstein in which he addresses this topic. And Rav Moshe Feinstein says as follows, and let's have a look at this inside because this is such an important source. Let me try and share the screen and I'm going to have a look at this. This is from the Igros Moshe. And I've just put the cursor. Can someone just nod if they can see where my cursor is at the bottom of the page? Yeah. Okay, is it visible? Is it reasonably legible on the screen? Yeah. Let me try and make it actually a little bigger just to... Okay. So here we have at the bottom of the page where my cursor is, where he talks about the Dalad Kosos Haseba, the issue of the Dalad Kosos Haseba. He says, Isha Chashuva Tzricha Haseba. The Gemara in Pesachim tells us that an important woman should lean. The Aflema Shestam Noshim Einon Tzrichas. Sorry, let me try and make this a little bigger. Haseba. He says, even the fact that most women do not need to lean, they need to explain. So the Gemara needs to explain why women don't lean. The Rashbam, the commentary on the Gemara in Pesachim gives two reasons. Tam Rishon Emas Bala, the first reason is because of awe of her husband. The Tam Sheni, and the second reason is Mishiltas Dravachoi, based on an early source. The love Dakai Donosh and Mizka, it's not the way of women to engage in drinking parties. So there's two reasons why women don't lean, either because of awe of their husbands, or because women in general don't engage in drinking parties. The Ikar Chiluk Ludin, and he says there's a distinction in halachic practice between these reasons. One distinction is Chiluk Hator, the Peligi Be'isha, Almana Grusha, Du Babal She'enoi Makbid. What happens if you have a woman who is single and therefore doesn't have a husband who is bothered by her leaning? Shalatam Rishon Tzricha Seba comes the first reason she would need to lean, and according to the second reason, she wouldn't need to lean. Then he carries on that he brings the source from the name of the Tosos, what we call the Modchai. Shekol, I'm pointing now with the cursor. Shekol Anoshim Shon and Chashuv saying the Tzricha Seba. All our women are Chashuv, and they need to lean. The Bach Hiksha, and the Bach asks, how can we change the halacha? Surely the reason is because of the awe of a husband. Even a chashuv woman, surely is meant to have the awe of a husband. Answers Ramosha, I don't understand this issue. Are sages saying that a woman should have fear of her husband and shouldn't feel comfortable leaning in front of them? It's not a good thing that a husband should be particular his wife and make her feel bad if she wishes to lean. As we've seen for many centuries, husbands are thankfully no longer makbid on their wives. And then he carries on, and he brings the source that all women nowadays are considered chashuv, need to lean. And he says, one can't explain that something's changed and suddenly all women have become chashuv. He said it must be that over time we have come to recognize that men do not have anything to be arrogant, to pride themselves in over their wives. And women have learned self-pride to realize their importance. So this is a very, very fundamental teshuvah of Ramosha Feinstein, in which he's making 2 points. The first point he's saying is that when the Gamora says women shouldn't lean, which the Rashbam explains because of the awe of their husbands on them, the Gamora is not saying that this is a good thing. On the contrary, this is a negative thing. Why on earth should that be the nature of the relationship, that men make women feel uncomfortable to lean in front of them? This is crazy, says Ramosha. This isn't a good thing. All the Gamora is saying is this is the social reality. We're living in circumstances where most women wouldn't feel comfortable leaning in front of their husbands, and therefore Halacha didn't demand that of them. It wouldn't be an appropriate expression of their acheros. But times have changed, thankfully so, says Ramosha, and it's not a good thing that husbands should have that sort of relationship with their wives, where wives feel uncomfortable to relax and lean, and that's somehow a disrespect. As we see for many centuries, this hasn't been the case. And therefore, the social reality has changed. The one's not saying it's a good thing, it's simply accepting the social reality and creating a halachic structure around that. The second thing Ramosha says is this view that nowadays women are choshev and therefore they lean. Says Ramosha, is this because women have changed to become more choshev? No. It's because men have changed and men have learned to recognize that they have no basis for feelings of superiority over ladies. And in turn, ladies have learned to recognize their importance to the world and to men, and therefore this is a structure that has changed. So we have a remarkable teshuvah of Ramosha Feinstein, in which he seems to acknowledge that in this case, halacha is reflecting social reality, and not necessarily even a healthy or positive social reality, but a reality as it was at the time, and therefore halacha reflected that, and therefore we have a rich halachic discussion about the concept of heseba nowadays. So this is a very important source and a primary halachic source around the idea that Chazal took into account the culture of their time, and on occasion this could affect how halacha would find expression. Now, I'm fast running out of time, so I simply can't leave this topic hanging there, because there's a more profound point that needs to be made. And this is that headlines and brief discussions don't serve well to address really important issues. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my series, and at every stage, is look at length in a forum that allows me to look in far more detail at topics that, generally speaking, one doesn't have the chance to do so, whether this is Torah Sheba'al Peh, whether this is Minhag, or whether this is rabbinic legislation, and in our sense, the relationship between Chazal and their society at the time, whether in science or culture. And headline discussions around the role of women in halacha do not serve any of us well. Because just like I was arguing that there isn't really a sugya called Torah and science, but there are many sugyas of Torah and science, and each one needs to be looked at with care. It is similarly the case when it comes to Torah and women. There isn't a single sugya. I started off with this particular sugya simply because, in a sense, in line with what we're talking about, it's an example where poskim acknowledge cultural influence, but equally there are other examples where this is clearly an expression of an absolute Torah value. Now, why is this the case? Why would there be halachic distinction between the role of men and ladies if indeed this is an expression of a core halachic matter? And the root of the answer is because Torah doesn't actually buy into an egalitarian model. It's not an egalitarian system. It's a system that makes distinctions between individuals and also between groups. It doesn't buy into an egalitarian system within Judaism. There's differences between Kohanim, Nevi'im, Yisraelim. There's differences in halachic practice between men and women, and difference in halachic practice between Yisrael v'Amim, between a Yisrael and a Nochri. Now, why are there such differences? Well, because actually there's room to be skeptical about a superficial application of egalitarianism or equality. Meaning to say, when we have a caste sticker in our philosophical worldview, in which we would say something like everyone is equal, we actually need to unpick what we mean by that. If we mean it as a statement of fact, that everyone is equal in every respect, clearly this is untrue. Some people are taller, some are shorter, some have blue eyes, some have brown eyes, some people are wealthier, some people are poorer, some people are healthier, less healthy, more charismatic, less charismatic, more or less intelligent, and so on and so forth. So clearly, the statement everyone is equal is not a descriptive statement of the reality of the world. Now, we may mean by that then something else. We may mean normatively, we wish everyone to be equal. But again, do we wish everyone to be equal? Do we want everyone to have the same intelligence, health, charisma, personality, appearance, health, abilities, etc.? Is this indeed the world we wish to live in? Can we create such a world? Is it even conceivable? Should one wish for things which are inconceivable? And what would be the social price that we would pay for it? Well, currently, the only way to make everyone equally healthy would be to reduce everyone to the lowest common denominator, and similarly in terms of intelligence and charisma and many other examples. And the consequences of trying to achieve equitable distribution of wealth also, as we know, would lead to an extreme and unviable communism. Similarly, when we say we wish everyone to be equal, if we mean by that even were we able to distribute wealth equally and create this extreme communism, we would still have the differences in life opportunities, in families in which people are raised, in the quality of parenting that they experience, education, activities, unless we brought up all children in dormitories. So the extremes to which we would have to go would undermine the fabric of our lives and undermine anything that we feel is viable or possible within how human beings can operate. Even if all kids were brought up in dormitories, it still wouldn't be equal. And even if we lowered everyone to the lowest common denominator in health and education, there would still be the kids who's on the upper bunk, the kids on the lower bunk, the kids whose bed is nearer the toilet and further from the toilet, nearer the window and further from the window. So this idea that the car sticker of everyone is equal represents a blanket statement of fact or a blanket statement of that which we wish and aspire for is simply incorrect. Now, I'm not here taking a political stance. There's clearly significant room for discussion, therefore, about to what degree and in which specific circumstances equality is a desirum or something we would wish to aspire to or could reasonably set out to achieve. I'm simply saying that if one persists on a car sticker model in which one just wants to summarize one's views about equality in one sentence, everyone is equal or everyone should be equal, this is clearly nonsense. It needs much further development or tweaking with respect to what do we aspire to equality, to what degree do we balance that with other important values in life, to what degree is this true to human nature, is this possible to apply, and is this even morally and philosophically something we should head towards? My attack is not a particular stance. All of us in this room, in this meeting, will come to different conclusions about where the balance should be and in what respects we think equality is a valuable or non-valuable aim and goal. I'm simply pointing out that we need to be more specific and clarify with respect to what degree, and in what way. And I use this simply to point out that we shouldn't be bothered by the concept that in application of a certain limited range of halachas, the Torah has inequality, because there is inequality built into the fabric of the universe, for better or for worse, in a way that we would all agree, as soon as we begin unpicking it with 5 minutes of thought, we would all agree this is part of the reality. So we've unfortunately run out of time now, so I'm going to continue this topic next week, because clearly much more needs to be said. I recognize that these are exceptionally sensitive matters, and therefore I apologize if anything I've said has caused offense. We're mid-discussion, so please let me finish this discussion before anyone judges me too harshly around either half of what I've said, because I've said 2 statements over here, both of which have the potential to cause upset. The first statement is from Ramosha Feinstein, that sometimes halacha is reflecting cultural and social circumstances which change and should change and need to change and have changed. And on the other hand, sometimes halacha reflects a fundamental existentialist view that it doesn't set as its sole aim being equitable and equal, and none of us should see equality as a blanket car sticker, one-line moral principle. So I hope I haven't offended everyone by those 2 halves of those statements, and in Mi'at Hashem next week we'll try and look at what a reasonable balance and path between these 2 extremes would be. But for now, I'll conclude what I wanted to say for today.
Rabbi Zobin, next week's Tanis.
Thank you.